He used the subway to escape. I offered as we stood out on noisy 8th Avenue. Goldman smiled broadly. I had the same thought. Witnesses are split on which way he went. I was curious whether you'd had an opinion. I think Sinigi used the subway, too. Trains have a special significance for him. I think trains are part of his ritual. After we had finished our tour of Penn Station and the surrounding streets, we made a trip downtown to One Police Plaza. By 4 o'clock, I knew what the NYPD had going. I personally contacted Boston, Philly, Baltimore, and suggested tactfully they pay attention to the train terminals. I passed on the same advice to Kyle Craig and the FBI. We're going to head back to Washington, I finally told Goldman and Groza. Thanks for calling us in on this. This helps a lot. I'll call if there's anything. You do the same, eh? Manny Goldman put out his hand. We shook. I'm pretty sure we haven't heard the last of Gary Sinigi. I nodded. I was sure of it, too.
In his mind, Gary Sinigi lay down beside Charles Joseph Whitman on the roof of the University of Texas Tower, circa 1966. He had been up there with Charlie Whitman many, many times before, ever since 1966, when the spree killer had become one of his boyhood idols. Over the years, many killers had captured his imagination, but none were like Charlie Whitman. Let's see now. Sinigi ran down the names of his favorites. James Herbity, who had opened fire without warning inside the McDonald's in San Isidro, California. He had killed 21, killed them at an even faster clip than they could dish out greasy hamburgers. Sinigi had actually copycatted the McDonald's shootings a few years earlier. That was when he'd first met Cross face-to-face. Another of his personal favorites was postman Patrick Sherrill, who'd blown away 14 co-workers in Edmond, Oklahoma, and also probably started the postman as madman paranoia. More recently, he had admired the handiwork of Martin Bryant at the Port Arthur Penal Colony in Tasmania. And then there was Thomas Watt Hamilton, who invaded the mind space of virtually everyone on the planet after his shooting spree at a primary school in Dunblane, Scotland. Gary Sinigi desperately wanted to invade everybody's mind space, to become a large, disturbing icon on the world's internet. He was going to do it, too. He had everything figured out. Charlie Whitman was still his sentimental favorite, though. Whitman was the original, the madman in the tower, a bad boy down there in Texas. Whitman had been a 25-year-old student of architectural engineering at the University of Texas when he'd gone tapioca pudding. He brought an arsenal up onto the observation deck of the limestone tower that soared 300 feet above the campus, and where he must have felt like God. Sinigi never forgot the actual passage from the Time magazine story on the Texas Tower shootings. He knew it word for word. Like many mass murderers, Charles Whitman had been an exemplary boy, the kind that neighborhood mothers hold up as a model to their own recalcitrant youngsters. He was a Roman Catholic altar boy and a newspaper delivery boy. Another master of disguise. Right. Nobody had known what Charlie was thinking or what he was ultimately going to pull off. He had carefully positioned himself under the sixth hand of the tower's clock. Then Charles Whitman opened fire at 11:48 in the morning. Beside him, on the 6-foot runway that went around the tower, were a machete, a Bowie knife, a 6mm Remington bolt-action rifle, a 35mm Remington, Luger pistol, and .357 Smith & Wesson revolver. The local and state police fired thousands of rounds up onto the tower, almost shooting out the entire face of the clock. But it took over an hour and a half to bring an end to Charlie Whitman. The whole world marveled at his audacity, his unique outlook and perspective. The whole goddamn world took notice. Someone was pounding on the door of Suniji's hotel room. The sound brought him back to the here and now. He suddenly remembered where he was. He was in New York City, in room 419 of the Plaza, which he always used to read about as a kid. He had always fantasized about coming by train to New York and staying at the Plaza. Well, here he was. "Who's out there?" he called from the bed. He pulled a semi-automatic from under the covers, aimed it at the peephole in the door. "Maid service," an accented Spanish female voice said. "Would you like your bed turned down?" No, I'm comfortable as is, Sunichi said, and smiled to himself. On second thought, hey, you can bring me some of those chocolate mints. I like those little mints. I need a little sweet treat. Gary Sunichi sat back against the headboard and continued to smile as the maid unlocked the door and entered. He thought about doing her, boffing the scaggy hotel maid, but he figured that wasn't such a good idea. He wanted to spend one night at the plaza. He'd been looking forward to it for years. It was worth the risk. The thing that he loved the most, what made it so perfect, was that nobody had any idea where this was going. Nobody would guess the end to this one. Not Alex Cross. Not anybody.
I managed to get home from New York in time for a late dinner with Nana and the kids. Damon, Jenny, and I cleaned up downstairs, and then we set the table in the dining room. Keith Jarrett was playing ever so sweetly in the background. This was nice. This was the way it was supposed to be. And there was a message in that for me. "I'm so impressed, Daddy," Janet commented as we circled the table putting out the good silverware, and also glasses and dinner plates I'd picked out years ago with my wife Maria. "You went all the way to New York? You came all the way back again? You're here for dinner. Very good, Daddy." I took a small, formal bow. "Thank you, my darling daughter. Now, this trip to New York I was on, about how far would you say that might be?" "Kilometers or miles?" Damon broke in from the other side of the table, where he was folding napkins like fans, the way they do in fancy restaurants. "Either measurement would be fine," I told him. "Approximately 248 miles one way," Janny answered. "How's that?" I opened my eyes as wide as I could, made a funny face, and let my eyes roll up into my forehead. I can still steal a scene or two myself. "Now, I'm impressed. Very good, Janny." She took a little bow, and then did a mock curtsy. "I asked Nana how far it was this morning," she confessed. "Is that okay?" "That's cool." Damon offered his thought on his sister's moral code. "It's called research, Velcro. Round trip, it's 496 miles, Damon said. "You two are smart!" I exclaimed in a loud, playful voice. "You're both smarty pants, smart Alex, and smarties of the highest order." "What's going on in there? What am I missing out on?" Nana finally called from the kitchen, which was overflowing with good smells from her cooking. "GE College Bowl," I called out to her. After dinner, we did the dishes, and then we had our bi-weekly boxing lesson in the basement. Damon and Janny are not only smart, they're tough little weasels. Nobody in school picks on those two. Brains and a wicked left hook, Janny brags to me sometimes. Hard combination to beat. We finally retired to the living room after the Wednesday night fights. Rosie the cat was curled up on Janny's lap. We were watching a little of the Orioles baseball game on television when Siniji slid into my head again. Of all the killers I had ever gone up against, he was the scariest. Siniji was single-minded, obsessive, but he was also completely whacked out. That's the proper medical term I learned years ago at Johns Hopkins. He had a powerful imagination fueled by anger, and he acted on his fantasies. Months back, Siniji had called to tell me he had left a cat at our house. A little present. He knew we had adopted her and loved little Rosie very much. He said that every time I saw Rosie the cat, I should think, "Gary's in the house. Gary is right here." I figured that Gary had seen the stray cat at our house and just made up a nasty story. Gary loved to lie, especially when his lies hurt people. That night, though, with Siniji running out of control again, I had a bad thought about Rosie. It frightened the hell out of me. Gary is in the house. Gary is right here. I nearly threw the cat out of the house, but that wasn't an option. So I waited until morning to do what had to be done with Rosie. God damn, Siniji. What the hell did he want from me? What did he want from my family? What could he have done to Rosie before he left her at our house? I felt like a traitor to my kids, and also to poor little Rosie. I was feeling subhuman as I drove 36 miles to Quantico the next morning. I was betraying the kids' trust and possibly doing a terrible thing. But I didn't see that I had any other choice. At the start of our trip, I had Rosie trapped in one of those despicable metal wire pet carriers. The poor thing cried and meowed and scratched so hard at the cage, and at me, that I finally had to let her out. "You be good now." I gave her a mild warning. Then I said, "Oh, go ahead and raise hell if you want to." Rosie proceeded to lay a huge guilt trip on me to make me feel miserable. Obviously, she learned this lesson well from Damon and Janny. Of course, she had no idea how angry she ought to be at me. But maybe she did. Cats are intuitive. I was fearful that the beautiful red and brown Abyssinian would have to be destroyed, possibly this morning. I didn't know how I could ever explain it to the kids. "Don't scratch up the car seats, and don't you dare jump on top of my head," I warned Rosie, but in a pleasant, conciliatory voice. She meowed a few times, and we had a more or less peaceful and pleasant ride to the FBI quarters in Quantico. I had already spoken to Chet Elliott at the Bureau's SAS Scientific Analysis section. He was waiting for Rosie and me. I was carrying the cat in one arm, with her cage dangling from the other. Now things were going to get very hard. To make things worse, Rosie got up on her hind legs and nuzzled my face. I looked into her beautiful green eyes, and I could hardly stand it. Chet was outfitted in protective gear, a white lab coat, white plastic gloves, even gold-tinted goggles. He peered at Rosie, then at me, and said, "Weird science." "Now what happens?" I asked Chet. "You go over to admin," he said. "Kyle Craig wants to see you. Says it's important. Of course, everything with Kyle is important as hell and can't wait another second." "What happens to Rosie?" I asked. "First step, some X-rays. Hopefully, Little Red here isn't a walking bomb, compliments of our friend Sinigi. If she isn't, we'll pursue toxicology. Examine her for the presence of drugs or poison in her tissues and fluids. You run along, go see Uncle Kyle. Red and I'll be just fine." He nodded his head, then flipped down his swimmer-style goggles. Rosie rubbed up against him, so I figured she knew he was okay. So far, anyway. I went to see what Kyle had on his mind, though I thought I knew what it was. I dreaded the confrontation, the war of wills that the two of us sometimes get into. Kyle wanted to talk about his Mr. Smith case. Smith was a violent killer who had murdered more than a dozen people in America and Europe. Kyle said it was the ugliest, most chilling spree he had ever seen. And Kyle isn't known for hyperbole. His office was on the top floor of the Academy building, but he was working out of a crisis room in the basement of admin. From what he told me, Kyle was practically camping out inside the war room, with its huge big board, state-of-the-art computers, phones, and a whole lot of FBI personnel, none of whom looked too happy on the morning of my visit. The big board read, "Mr. Smith 19, good guys 0, in bright red letters. "Looks like you're in your glory again. Nowhere to go but up," I said. Kyle was sitting at a big walnut desk, lost in study of the evidence board. I already knew about the case more than I wanted to. Smith had started his string of gory murders in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had then moved on to Europe, where he was currently blazing a bewildering trail. The latest victim was a policeman in London, a well-known inspector who had just been assigned to the Mr. Smith case. Smith's work was so strange and kinky and unhinged that it was seriously discussed in the media that he might be an alien, as in a visitor from outer space. At any rate, Smith definitely seemed inhuman. No human could commit the monstrosities as he did. That was the working theory.
"I thought you'd never get here,"
Kyle said when he saw me. I raised my hands defensively. "I can't help. Won't do it, Kyle. First, because I'm already overloaded with Sinigi. Second, because I'm losing my family on account of my work habits." Kyle nodded.
All right, I hear you. But since you're here with a little time on your hands, I do need to talk to you about Mr. Smith. Believe me, Alex, you've never seen anything like this.
Kyle proceeded to tell me about an agent named Thomas Pierce. Pierce was in charge of the Mrs. Smith case. What was intriguing was that Smith had brutally murdered Pierce's fiancée some years back.